Well, Landon, last week when we discussed the issue of ethics, I thought that was a very good discussion. We had some very good comments and good statements, and I think one that stands out, and I think that most of the people who would watch that episode are going to remember, was there was a very important question asked toward the end of the segment there, and it had to do with the issue of personal ethics. And I'll paraphrase it, that basically there was a question that was posed for discussion. What would your ethics be like if there were no God? And that is a very important question to ask. And to set that up a little bit, you and I both know that atheism, as it stands, with this abandonment of any truly objective moral law, and the absence of any transcendental basis for ethics, along with the abolishment of a created universe in lieu of one that basically exists due to mindless and random chance, puts atheism as a worldview in a very difficult category. And that category is how does it explain meaning? Which is basically the question that was posed. Even Voltaire made the comment that we are nothing more than tormented atoms in a bed of mud devoured by death and a mockery of fate. So what I want you to do is respond to that question. If there were no God, truly there were no God, what would be your basis for ethics? In other words, put on for us the true face of atheism and show us what a world would look like that was devoid of any ultimate meaning.
And honestly, Tony, that very question is really at the heart. What exactly are these individuals fighting for, in a sense? What are they trying to promote? What are they trying to take away? What are they trying to insert in its place? And I think the weight of that question, and that's why we wanted to start off the first series of these conversations with ethics, because it's incredibly important to establish that as why do you live the way that you live, and what is the basis with which you do live that way. Now, when Dustin had asked me that particular question the way that he did, it shows, for one, sort of the free exchange that we have here, that it's not really scripted that way. I didn't expect that type of question to come at me, but I answered it the way that he asked it, very specifically, when he said, if you could be convinced that atheism was true and that your faith, religion, whatever term you'd want to use for that, is false. Now, within that, first of all, you would have to shore up a lot of loose ends. And so I clarified that with that statement of, okay, you've tied up all the loose ends. We seem to have an explanation of mostly all the phenomena that we're aware of. You can explain the human predicament and everything else. You've really inserted a lot of information that we don't have access to right now in terms of the origins of the universe, mind-body dualist problem, and so on. But I'll grant you that. Let's say that those issues have been resolved. And then what's left is pure atheism. And the reason I answered it the way that I did, very specifically, is once you remove the transcendent, eternal creator, because things like ethics, meaning, morals are immaterial. They're completely immaterial, so they carry no prescriptive objectivity to them. Once you've removed God from that picture, if I have to look at my life that way, he took me back to my atheism as a teenager. And so I just answered the question honestly, the way that he asked it, which was, if your life as it is right now, how would you live? I would promptly spend the next moments of my life looking for a gun and splatter my brain all over this wall, quite literally. Because without God, I'm a horrible husband, I'm a terrible father, I hate my job, it's miserable, I'm in pain most of the time, I'm constantly exhausted. The best moments of my life are when I'm asleep. Because all those things that have meaning and value are, well, God says a godly woman is a gift. The Bible says children are a blessing. God gives us a doctrine of vocation that we're building the kingdom. So our labor is not in vain. Right now, as R.C. Sproul says, counts forever. We're actually building eternity. We're building infinite concept. That's what gives it the actual purpose and justification why I would even get out of bed. He just took that away from me. So now what's left? Anything to kind of endure whatever pain, suffering, shortcomings, and for most of my life is failure and disappointment, to be honest. I get sick of the failure and disappointment, so to me, everybody dies. Are you going to remember anything when you're dead? This is what I wrestled with for, years as a teenager. As a committed atheist teenager, wrestling with the ideas, I wasn't very smart in school, wasn't very athletic, didn't have a lot of money. I just didn't have a lot of those things handed to me. And so it really became difficult to not establish, just go to sleep, man. Just let it all go away and just go to sleep and never wake up.
When atheism tries to produce a life with ultimate meaning, it falls short. What men like Edgar Allan Poe, Jacques Rousseau, Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Sartre, all these men wrestled with the idea of meaning. And they had to because they had removed that transcendental basis for that. So when an atheist tries to say that his life has meaning, or there's some components to that life that has meaning, is he deceiving himself?
That's exactly what the existential philosophers dealt with in the early 20th century, because in that atheistic journey, I'm not going to say as a teenager, I don't want to give any pretensions or false information as though I started reading the heavyweights at that point. It really wasn't until my degradation to agnosticism that started to probe my interest a little bit more in what some of these deeper atheists were thinking of. But flat out, in Camus' work in The Myth of Sisyphus, you have to lie to yourself. It's point blank in that text as he uses that old Greek myth. And for those that aren't familiar, Sisyphus was cursed with rolling a heavy boulder up the hill, and it would roll back down, and he had to do this for eternity. And so he was, if you go back in time, sort of the Greek parable of that was, is that our life? Are we just pushing boulders? Which I find it brilliant. I mean, that's entirely, atheism is not new. You come from Pythagoras, man is a measure of all things, to a certain extent Plato. Not the type of atheism that we have here today, but really trying to justify things without what we would call, immaterial causes or sustaining powers of some. So these ideas have been wrestled with all through time, and the idea is that Camus came to as an existentialist is you create your own meaning, just do. You just do. You actualize yourself by your choices. You create meaning. And even when you know that boulder's coming right back down the hill and you just got to push it back up again, and he actually inserts this word, Tony, is interesting in that particular book. Why I love Camus so much, he was an honest atheist that way.
Yeah.
You just believe that it's going to stay. And he uses the word hope. So an existentialist atheist has to use the word hope. You live on a hope.
Is that not borrowed from Christianity?
Yeah. I mean, among other religions, I don't want to degrade any other faith, but yeah, unquestionably. And his famous quote is, the only question with which modern man must deal is the question of whether or not man should commit suicide. And so Camus was wrestling with that, as were the early existentialist philosophers, by actualizing yourself, by creating your meaning. And they tried to bring dignity to death by saying, because our life ends, therefore it has value, you have to make it. One of Sartre's famous quotes, and it was even in that movie The Box, was, you're born in this world free or a slave. You must choose which. And so from that, even Sartre, Camus, all these fellows was, and Schaeffer, I think, honed this better than anybody that I've read, is they had to jump to the area of non-reason to find meaning. Because had they stayed in pure reason, pure empiricism, logical positivism, all these materialistic, scientific method types of worldviews, all that was left is nihilism or nothingness. Nothing has meaning. And because that's unlivable, because the felt reality that every single human seems to possess doesn't comport with that, what were they creating in order to do that? They created a system of existentialism that was you generate meaning within yourself. Whatever you're doing, that's your meaning. And you ask the question why, they don't want you to ask that. Don't ask why, just do.
As necessary, because without that, they were faced with the reality of a cold, dark atheism that left them no reason to live.
Nothing. There would genuinely actually be nothing. Sorry to jump in on that,
No,
but
go ahead.
you're genuinely left with the idea, if it's reductionistic that way, that we are just atoms bouncing off each other in that sense, and things like meaning, value, love, dignity, justice, self, all those things, those are immaterial things. So how do they generate from the material? They're illusions. They're not real. And so what does carry meaning, especially the very second you're dead, what are you going to remember about life? Then what did it matter? You're going to be dead a lot longer than you're alive.
When you gave your comment, your response, it shocked me. But now that I listened to what you're saying, it should have. Because what you were doing was giving us a picture of the true face of atheism. In other words, in its logical conclusion, where you take it in a snapshot. So I think you're dead on that. Now, let me build on this and ask you something else now. Because you do believe in God, and because you do have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, how does answering the question of meaning now change for you?
It's and that's where it is significantly different, because when you know that you've been created by the God of the universe who created all things, he now has the authority to insert the meaning, because his perspective is from eternity at that point. So he's speaking into this cold, dark, stale, if it was just pure atheism. Because now every single thing I do builds eternity. There's perpetuity to the individual, or there's continuity.
Does that transcend into ethics?
Well, and where it does is based on God's law. Essentially, it generates from God's law. God has given his law, which, as we learn all through scriptures, shows us how condemned we are. It shows how we fail at that. It shows that we stand before a perfect, holy God, which demands absolute perfection in all things, and that law condemns us. And yet, on the other side of redemption, it generates us, motivates us, and fuels us to live this life glorifying to him, building his kingdom. And things like the Lutheran doctrine of vocation and others is loving your neighbor as yourself with your gifts, with with what we would call your callings in life. If that's to be a mechanic, a lawyer, politician, doctor, whatever that is, all of those are services of serving your fellow man, but it's ultimately serving God and his kingdom because of what he's established on earth. And so, as I said earlier, a godly woman, in my perspective, and it could go the other way with a godly man, of course, is a gift from God. Children are a blessing at that point. They're no longer a nuisance. They're not annoying. They're not financial parasites. They're none of these materialistic things, which is why the modern West's reproductive rate is 1.3 or lower. They can't even rebuild their society now because their secularism has looked at kids as a nuisance or a hindrance. And certainly, even in today's concept of what we would call normal, certainly if they have any type of handicap or disability, you're going to be very much encouraged by your doctor to not go through with birth and giving birth to a child and raising that child, that somehow they're lost in value. We're all pretty familiar with Richard Dawkins' recent comment about aborting children with Down syndrome that they have, that they can't live a fulfilled life, don't let them live at all. He's just, again, that's just a logical outflow. Now, atheists can rant and rave against that he shouldn't say that, but all he's doing, it's like an offensive coordinator just opening up the playbook and showing you what it's in there, man. You really can't get around that. For us as believers, even with a handicap, that individual was created by God, knit together, fiber by fiber, and has intrinsic worth and value because it has the stamp of eternity placed upon it.
Good.
And that's why we care about it. That's why we create orphanages. That's why we created hospitals. That's why we care so much about the individual man, because he's not a nuisance, a hindrance. He's not a polluter that needs to be removed or restricted. He is bearing the very image of God. And so I stand here today different in that I get to build eternity on God's terms instead of railing against him as I was in my youth, fighting against it, arguing against it, being denial of it. It now puts significant meaning for that very reason is the eternity.
All right. So let me ask you one final question then. Will Durant posed this question, and I'll pose it to you. He said, the greatest question of our time is, can man live without God? So can he?
Can, and because can denotes ability.
Truly live.
Right, yeah. Well, obviously they have, but are they living really? As I think one of the famous quotes Aldous Huxley gave, something along the lines of, I did not reject the notion of God for any empirical reasons, but it simply freed me to my erotic passions.
That's correct. That's pretty much it.
Something along those
That
lines.
is.
And I think that's a little bit more of the notion of where this push comes from. And even as Nietzsche had said, if God does not exist, all things are permissible at that point. And so I think what they're looking for is they look at the law of God as constrictive, binding. This prevents some sort of, whether you would call it pleasure or fulfillment, that I'm not able to do. A lot of it comes from pride, as the Lord calls us to be humble and crushes us with his law, realizing we need mercy and grace every moment of our life, that if I'm rather attractive, if I'm rather intelligent, rather talented, I don't really want to squander any of those gifts. And so the number one sin that the scriptures tell us about being pride, leading to those things, that can be a hindrance for a lot of individuals, because why should they have to suppress what they think elevates them above other people in any way, shape, or form, right? For what reason or what value? And so they can live without God. Can they live consistently without God?
That's
the question.
the key.
The question would be no. At some point in time, you're going to have to jump to the area of non-reason. At some point in time, you're going to have to implement an arbitrary, or what I would call a random or relativistic set of ethics that are okay for you. May not be okay for anybody else, but they're certainly okay for you or your particular group or society that's agreed that this is just what you want to agree to, which is not consistent because they're not universally prescriptive. And ultimately, I think Camus and the fellows were just right, that you have to lie to yourself. You have to,
in the area of meaning, right?
In the area of meaning, you know that boulder's coming back down, but you push it, and you push it with hope that this time it's going to stay. You just press down that knowledge consistently that I know this boulder's coming back down upon me, but I have to push it. You know, because you're either slave or free. I'm going to choose to be free, and I'm going to choose to hope that this boulder's going to stay, even though I know it's not.
Even though you know it's not.
Even though I know it's not. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's a good question, and obviously the new atheism has promoted kind of this very strong sense that they, I mean, I get to give credit. Jean-Paul Sartre said he never lived a day of despair in his life. So, you know, I don't want to shortchange any of the fellas if they, you know, Mike Shermer says he's happy. You know, he lives a happy life. He has no problems with it. Just he's created his little fulfillment. So I'm not going to take away from what these individuals say about their life, whatever that case may be. I would say ultimately, and this is where it's universal for everybody, what's it going to matter when they're dead?
Right.
Are they going to remember anything when they're dead? And if so, where did that meaning go? If it was wrapped up in you, you are going to die. And so then now where'd that meaning go? And then on an individual level, well, you know, I'm sorry, Sartre. I'm sorry, Dr. Shermer. I'm not as smart as you guys. And so I'm frustrated with a lot of misery and disappointment and a lot of failure. And it just bothers me. I think I just want to go to sleep.
And there would be no logical reason for not going to that point. And there have been men who have, very educated men, who have decided to do that. And I think of one, and we talked about it before we started filming, and that was Hobart Maurer. You know, one-time professor of psychology, the one-time professor at Harvard University in psychology, one-time professor at Yale, head of the American Psychological Society. At the age of 75, made that decision. There are other things, of course, surrounded that. We're not trying to paraphrase his life down to one statement, but certainly there have been men who have looked at their life and said, there is no real logical reason for existing. And that is a scary thought, Landon.
It should be.
It's scary. And I think that's what was so horrible, which is a good way. It was the horror of your statement that I think should shock people who were watching the past episode and then this one right now to really take it to heart of what their worldview really carries you to.
And I don't want to, it's, not to try to focus on myself, honestly, but he asked me, and that question, he took me back to my atheism. And so that's where I was. That's where I wrestled for so many years as a young teenager. That was kind of the relevance of it. So yeah, I sort of felt the need to sort of address it that way. But what's going on, man?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I think that was good.